The shuttle descended through thick gray clouds, and Valari Sumdran pressed her face against the cold window to catch her first glimpse of Earth, the world her people called the Death Planet, the homeworld of the species that had brought the mighty Calorian Empire to its knees in just 3 years of brutal warfare. She was not here as a conqueror or a diplomat in the traditional sense. She was here as a bride, a peace offering wrapped in silk and political necessity, the third princess of an empire that had finally admitted it could not win this war. The terms of the treaty had been simple and humiliating: a royal marriage to bind the two species together, a symbolic union that would prevent future conflict. And Valari had been chosen because she was expendable. The third daughter with no real claim to the throne, pretty enough to be acceptable, but unimportant enough to be sacrificed. Her mother had wept when the decision was announced, but her father, the emperor, had simply nodded and told her to do her duty for the empire. And now here she was, descending toward a planet that her people whispered about in fear, wondering what kind of monster she would be forced to call husband. The shuttle touched down at a military base outside a city called Portland, and Valari took a deep breath before the doors opened, steeling herself for whatever horror awaited her on the other side. She expected armed guards and cold metal corridors. She expected to be treated like a prisoner or a trophy, but what she found instead confused her completely. A man stood waiting on the landing pad, dressed in a simple military uniform without any of the elaborate decorations her people used to display rank and power. He was tall by human standards, with brown hair cut short and eyes the color of a cloudy sky. And he smiled when he saw her, a gentle expression that seemed entirely wrong for a warrior from a death world. "Princess Valari," he said, and his voice was softer than she expected. "I am Commander Daniel Harris. Welcome to Earth, and I hope your journey was comfortable." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for hidden cruelty or predatory intent, but she found nothing except what appeared to be genuine warmth and perhaps a touch of nervousness. "Thank you, Commander," she replied in carefully practiced English, keeping her voice neutral and her expression guarded. The journey was acceptable. He nodded and gestured toward a vehicle waiting nearby. And as they walked together, Valari noticed that there were no chains, no armed escorts pointing weapons at her back, no visible signs that she was anything other than an honored guest. The drive to what would become her new home took them through the human city, and Valari watched through the window as buildings and people flashed past. Ordinary citizens going about their ordinary lives as if there had never been a war at all, as if thousands had not died on both sides. "This is where we will live," Daniel said, as the vehicle stopped in front of a modest dwelling. Nothing like the grand palaces she had grown up in, but clean and well-maintained, with a small garden of colorful flowers near the entrance. "I hope it is acceptable." I tried to learn what Calorians prefer, but there was not much information available. Valari stepped out of the vehicle and studied the building with suspicious eyes, wondering where the trap was hidden when the cruelty would reveal itself. "It is adequate," she said coldly, refusing to show any emotion that could be used against her. Inside the dwelling was warm and filled with soft light, and Daniel showed her around with the awkward enthusiasm of someone who desperately wanted to make a good impression, but had no idea how. "This is your room," he said, opening a door to reveal a private space with a comfortable bed and large windows. "I thought you might want your own space. There is no expectation that this is a political arrangement, and I want you to feel safe." Valari blinked at him in confusion, because this was not how conquered peoples were supposed to treat their new masters. This was not how warriors from death worlds behaved toward foreign brides forced upon them through treaty. "You do not wish to claim your rights as my husband?" she asked directly, watching his face carefully for any sign of deception. Daniel's cheeks turned a strange red color, and he shook his head quickly, looking more embarrassed than threatening. "No, absolutely not. Not unless you wanted, which you obviously would not want. And I would never expect. Look, this situation is strange for both of us, he stammered, running a hand through his hair in obvious distress. I just want us to find a way to coexist peacefully. That is the whole point of this marriage, is it not, peace? She had no answer for him because peace had never been the point from her perspective. Survival had been the point. Sacrifice had been the point. The peace was something she had not dared to hope for. The first weeks in her new home passed in awkward silence and careful observation. Valari watched Daniel constantly, waiting for the mask to slip, waiting for the monster to emerge, but he never raised his voice, never threatened her, never demanded anything. He cooked meals for her, researching calorian dietary requirements and attempting to recreate dishes from her homeworld with varying degrees of success. He learned phrases in her language and practiced them with terrible pronunciation that somehow made her want to smile instead of cringe. Each morning, he left for his duties at the military base, and each evening he returned with small gifts, books about human culture, recordings of human music, flowers from the garden that he thought she might find beautiful. Why do you do this? She asked him one evening, genuinely bewildered by his behavior. I am your enemy. My people killed thousands of your soldiers. You should hate me. Daniel looked at her with those strained gray eyes, and for a moment she saw something deep and sad hidden behind his gentle expression. The war is over, he said quietly, and you did not start it. You did not bomb our stations or kill our people. You are just someone caught in the middle of something terrible, same as me. And I see no reason to make your life harder than it needs to be. That night Valari lay awake in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand the creature she had married. This human who should have been a monster, but instead made her breakfast and learned her language and gave her flowers. She received encrypted messages from home, from handlers who wanted intelligence about human weaknesses and military capabilities. And she dutifully reported what she observed, the layout of the city, the movements of military personnel, anything that might be useful in a future conflict. But as the weeks passed and Daniel continued to treat her with unfailing kindness, Valari began to wonder if her handlers understood what they were asking, if anyone back home truly comprehended what humanity was. Because the humans she observed did not act like conquerors or predators. They acted like something far more dangerous, something her people had no experience fighting. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, Valari felt the cold grip of real fear. Not fear of Daniel or his people, but fear of what would happen if her empire was foolish enough to start another war with a species that did not know how to be cruel to a helpless enemy princess. 3 months had passed since Valari arrived on Earth, and she was no closer to understanding the strange creatures she now lived among, though not for a lack of trying. Daniel had begun taking her to social gatherings and military functions, introducing her to his colleagues and friends with a pride that seemed entirely genuine. And she found herself studying these humans like a scientist observing alien specimens. She expected to see dominance displays and aggressive posturing, the kind of behavior that defined Calorian society, where strength was everything and weakness was death. Instead, she watched humans embrace each other warmly, laugh at jokes she did not understand, and cry openly when sad stories were shared. Why do they weep in public? She asked Daniel one evening, after watching a group of soldiers comfort a crying comrade whose father had recently died. Is this not a display of weakness that invites attack? Daniel looked at her with that gentle confusion he often wore when she asked such questions. Grief is not weakness, he explained softly, and showing emotion does not make someone a target here. Those soldiers are his friends, his brothers, and they would never use his pain against him. They share it with him so he does not have to carry it alone. This concept was so foreign to Valari that she had no response, could form no adequate reply. A week later, Daniel took her to meet his family, And Valari spent the entire drive rehearsing defensive responses and preparing for hostility. After all, she was the alien who had married into their bloodline, the enemy who now shared their name. But his sister Megan greeted her with a warm hug that lasted too long and felt too sincere. And his mother Patricia made her sit at the kitchen table and fed her homemade cookies while asking endless questions about Calorian culture. Danny used to bring home injured birds when he was a boy, Megan told her while Daniel helped his mother in the kitchen. A fond smile on her face as she remembered. He would build little nests for them and feed them by hand until they could fly again. Once he walked 15 miles in a blizzard to bring medicine to old Mrs. Crawford when she got sick and no one else would make the trip. Valari listened to these stories with growing confusion, trying to reconcile the gentleman who made her breakfast with the terrifying warrior her people had fought against. Was he not a soldier? She asked carefully. Did he not kill Calorians in the war? Megan's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more complex. He did what he had to do to protect us, she said quietly, but it was never something he wanted. Danny cried for 3 days after his first battle, and I think a part of him has never stopped crying. Humans do not enjoy war, Valari, even when we are very good at it. That evening, Valari found herself sitting alone with Daniel on the porch of his family home, watching strange earth insects dance around a lamp in the cooling air. Why did your people fight so hard against us? She asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since she first learned about the war. The Calorian Empire has conquered dozens of species, and none of them resisted like humanity did. What makes you different? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dancing insects with distant eyes. Do you know how the war started? He asked finally, and his voice carried an edge she had never heard before, a hint of the soldier hidden beneath the gentle husband. There was a border dispute, Valari said, reciting what she had been taught. Tensions escalated and military action became necessary. That is not what happened, Daniel said. And now he turned to look at her directly, those gray eyes suddenly cold and hard like steel. The Calorian fleet attacked Harmony Station without warning. It was a civilian outpost, a research facility where scientists studied deep space phenomena. There were no weapons there, no military value whatsoever. 3,000 people died in 15 minutes, including 400 children who were living there with their parents. Valari felt something cold spread through her chest because she had not known this, had never been told this truth. That is why humanity fought, Daniel continued, his voice thick with remembered pain. Not for territory or resources or pride. We fought because your empire killed our children. And we would burn the entire galaxy down before we let that happen again. She wanted to deny it. Wanted to call him a liar, but something in his eyes told her this was the truth. The real truth that her government had hidden behind diplomatic language and noble-sounding justifications. I did not know, she whispered. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, she felt genuine shame for what her people had done. They told us it was a military installation, that humans fired first. I know, Daniel said. And somehow his voice had gone gentle again, the steel fading from his eyes as quickly as it had appeared. That is why I do not blame you. You were lied to, just like our people were lied to about many things. The truth is always the first casualty of war. They sat in silence for a long time after that. And Valari thought about what she had learned, about children dying on a space station, about a species that fought not for conquest, but for protection, about soldiers who cried after battle and brought home injured birds. When they returned to their home that night, something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had cracked. May I ask you something personal? Valari said as they stood in the hallway between their separate rooms. Of course, Daniel replied. Do you hate me? She asked, and the question felt dangerous on her tongue, like admitting a weakness that could be exploited Truly, honestly, do you hate me for what my people did? Daniel studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him considering his answer carefully. I hate what happened, he said finally. I hate that good people died for nothing. I hate that we were forced to become killers. I hate that you were sent here as a political pawn with no choice in the matter. But I do not hate you, Valari, and I am not sure I could even if I tried. Hatred takes too much energy, and I would rather spend that energy on something more useful, like figuring out how to make that spice bread you liked last week. She laughed before she could stop herself. A small sound of genuine amusement that surprised them both. It was acceptable, she said with mock dignity, lifting her chin in the way her mother had taught her to project royal authority. High praise from a princess, Daniel replied with a grin, and for just a moment he looked like a boy bringing home injured birds, not a soldier who had killed her people in war. That night Valari lay awake again, but this time her thoughts were not suspicious or fearful. Instead, she found herself thinking about humans who fought to protect their children, who cried over their enemies, who spent their hatred on learning to bake bread. A small crack had formed in everything she thought she knew, and through that crack light was beginning to seep in. She still sent reports to her handlers, but now she found herself questioning what she wrote, wondering if the military intelligence they wanted would only lead to more dead children on both sides. The humans had a word for what she was feeling. Daniel had taught it to her the other day. Conscience. And Valari was beginning to understand that a conscience could be the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. 6 months into her marriage, Valari received permission to access the Human Historical Archives, a vast digital library containing records of Earth's entire history. Daniel had arranged the access for her, believing she was simply curious about her new home, eager to understand the culture she would spend the rest of her life within. He did not know that her handlers back home had specifically requested intelligence about human military history, weaknesses that might be exploited in a future conflict. She began her research with clinical detachment, treating it as a mission for her empire. But what she discovered over the following weeks shattered every assumption she had ever made about humanity. The Calorian Empire had conquered 47 species over 10,000 years of expansion, and every one of those species had eventually surrendered when the cost of fighting became too high. This was the natural order of things, the mathematical reality of warfare. And the Calorians had built their entire military strategy around this simple truth. Every species has a breaking point. But as Valari read through human history, she realized with growing horror that humanity had no breaking point. She read about a city called Stalingrad, where humans fought building by building, room by room, for 6 months in freezing winter conditions, losing over 1 million soldiers rather than surrender to an invader. She read about a tiny nation called Finland that fought against an enemy 20 times their size, using nothing but knowledge of their homeland and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She read about resistance movements that lasted for decades, fighters who hid in mountains and forests and swamps, who passed their weapons to their children and their children's children, who kept fighting long after any reasonable species would have accepted conquest. The examples went on, century after century, a species that simply did not understand how to give up. But the truly terrifying discoveries were the smaller stories, the individual acts of defiance that seemed to define human nature at its core. She read about soldiers who threw themselves onto explosive devices to save their comrades, making a split-second choice to die so others could live. She read about civilians who hid refugees in their homes during genocides, knowing they would be killed if discovered, choosing death over complicity. She read about pilots who crashed their damaged aircraft into enemy targets rather than eject to safety, spending their final moments as weapons. "What are you?" Valari whispered to the empty archive room, her hands trembling over the control panel. "What kind of creatures are you?" The Calorian approach to war was mathematical and logical. Calculate losses, assess probabilities, surrender when victory becomes impossible, preserve resources for future opportunities. Humans did not think this way. Humans did not calculate acceptable losses because to them, no loss was acceptable. They mourned every death and remembered every name and used their grief as fuel for even fiercer resistance. A Calorian general would order retreat when 90% of forces were destroyed. A human general would consider 90% losses a reason to dig in deeper, to make the enemy pay for every additional inch. Daniel found her in the archive room late that night, sitting in darkness with tears streaming down her face. "Valari?" he said softly, concern evident in his voice as he approached carefully. "What is wrong? What happened?" She looked up at him with new eyes, seeing for the first time the full truth of what her husband was, what all humans were. "I finally understand," she said, her voice broken and rough. "I finally understand why my people were losing the war." Daniel sat down beside her, close enough to comfort, but not so close as to crowd her, and waited patiently for her to explain. "We thought we were fighting an empire," Valari continued, gesturing at the screens filled with human history. "We thought we were fighting a political structure that could be pressured and negotiated with, and eventually forced to surrender like every other species we have conquered. And now?" Daniel asked quietly. "Now I know the truth," she said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "We were not fighting an empire. We were fighting a species that does not know how to stop fighting. Your people would have burned your own cities before letting us take them. You would have poisoned your own farmland and destroyed your own resources rather than see them fall into our hands. You would have fought with rocks and sticks after your weapons were gone. And you would have taught your children to keep fighting after you died." Daniel did not deny any of it, simply nodded slowly with sadness in his gray eyes. "We do not want war," he said softly. "We really do not. Humans are capable of incredible kindness and creativity and love. We would rather build than destroy, rather heal than harm. But when someone threatens what we love, when someone hurts our children, something happens to us. What happens?" Valari asked, though she already knew the answer. "We stop being kind," Daniel said simply. "We stop calculating costs and benefits. We stop thinking about tomorrow. All that matters is protecting our own, and we will do anything, sacrifice anything, destroy anything to achieve that goal. It is not rational and it is not strategic, but it is what we are." Valari reached out and took his hand. The first time she had initiated physical contact with him, and she felt him stiffen in surprise before relaxing into her grip. "Your people should never have attacked that station," she said. "The moment those children died, the war was already lost. My empire was too arrogant to see it, but there was never any possibility of victory after that day." "No," Daniel agreed, and his hand squeezed hers gently. "There was not." They sat together in the darkness for a long time. Human and Calorian, husband and wife, two people caught in the aftermath of a war that should never have happened. When Valari finally returned to her room that night, she composed a new message to her handlers. But this time, she did not include military intelligence or strategic assessments. Instead, she wrote a warning, a desperate plea for her government to understand what she had learned. She told them about Stalingrad and Finland and resistance movements that lasted generations. She told them about soldiers who died for strangers and civilians who sacrificed themselves for refugees. She told them about a species that burned with an inner fire that could not be extinguished by any force in the galaxy. "Do not start another war with humanity," she wrote at the end of her message. "There is no path to victory. There is only different speeds of defeat. They are not like us, and they are not like any species we have ever encountered. If you attack them again, they will not stop until one of our civilizations is completely destroyed. And I promise you, it will not be theirs." She sent the message and lay down on her bed, staring at the ceiling with new understanding of the universe. Somewhere out there, in the cold depths of space, her government was probably already planning revenge, already convincing themselves that the next war would be different. They were fools, and their foolishness might doom them all. But in this moment, in this small human home with her strange human husband, Valari allowed herself to hope that wisdom might prevail, that her warning might be heard, that peace might actually be possible. It was a small hope, fragile as a candle flame, but it was the first hope she had felt in a very long time. The response from the Calorian High Council arrived 3 weeks after Valari sent her warning, and it was exactly what she had feared. They called her assessment emotional and compromised, accused her of being seduced by human propaganda, reminded her that her duty was to provide useful intelligence, not philosophical musings about enemy psychology. The message ended with a direct order: continue gathering military information and cease all personal commentary, or face charges of treason upon eventual return to Calorian space. But buried within the official reprimand was something far more terrifying: references to fleet movements and weapons development. Subtle hints that the High Council was already preparing for a second invasion. Valari read the message 3 times, her blood running cold with each pass through the carefully worded threats and implications. They had learned nothing from the First War, had taken no wisdom from their defeat. They still believed that humanity could be conquered if only the right strategy were employed, the right weapons deployed, the right pressure applied. They were going to restart the war, and billions would die because of their arrogance. Over the following months, Valari continued to receive encrypted transmissions from home, and the picture they painted grew darker with each communication. The hawks in the High Council had gained power, pushing aside the moderates who had negotiated the peace treaty. They spoke of human atrocities and Calorian honor, whipping up public sentiment for revenge. Military production had increased by 300%. New weapons were being developed specifically designed to counter human tactics, and fresh soldiers were being conscripted from every corner of the empire. A date had been set. She learned from a particularly careless transmission. The invasion would launch in 6 months. A massive first strike designed to cripple Earth's defenses before humanity could respond. Valari felt sick as she read the details, knowing that her handlers expected her to provide targeting data for that first strike, coordinates that would help Calorian missiles find their marks. But she had lived among humans for nearly a year now, had seen how they loved and grieved and protected each other, had watched Daniel cook her breakfast and teach her about human music and hold her hand when she cried, about things she could not explain. These were not monsters to be destroyed. These were people, strange and terrifying and wonderful people, and she could not be the weapon used to murder them. She found Daniel in the small garden behind their home, tending to the flowers he had planted for her in the first weeks of their marriage. And something about the peaceful scene made her heart ache with a sadness she could barely contain. "Daniel," she said, and something in her voice made him look up immediately, concern flooding his features. "What is wrong?" he asked, setting down his gardening tools and moving toward her with quick steps. "You look like you have seen death itself. I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice was shaking despite her best efforts to control it. "Something terrible, something that might make you hate me." Daniel stood before her, steady as a rock, waiting without judgment or fear. And so Valari told him everything: the encrypted messages, the intelligence reports, the High Council's plans for invasion, the targeting data she had been ordered to provide. She told him about watching and observing and reporting in those early months when she still believed she was serving her empire. And she told him about the gradual change in her heart. the growing realization that humanity was not the enemy she had been taught to hate. "I have not sent them anything useful in months," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But they are going to attack anyway. They have set a date, and in 6 months they are going to try to destroy everything you love." She expected anger. She expected betrayal and fury, and perhaps even violence. But Daniel simply stood there, processing her words with that quiet intensity she had come to know so well. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "Because I do not want billions to die," Valari said desperately. "Because I have seen what humans become when you threaten their families. And I know that my people cannot win this war. They will throw everything they have at you, and you will destroy them. And nothing will be left of either civilization." "That is not what I meant," Daniel said gently. "I meant, why are you telling me specifically? Why trust me with this information when you could have gone to intelligence services or military commanders?" Valari stared at him, realizing that she did not have a logical answer to his question. "Because you are my husband," she said finally, the words feeling strange and true on her lips. "Because you have shown me nothing but kindness since the day I arrived. And I trust you to do the right thing with this information." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. And then he reached out and took her hands in his, holding them firmly but gently. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for choosing to tell me, for choosing peace over loyalty to an empire that was willing to sacrifice you as a political pawn. What happens now?" Valari asked, and she was surprised to realize that she was not afraid. Whatever came next, she had made her choice, and there was a strange peace in that. "Now we go to the people who need to know," Daniel said. "We tell them everything, and we hope that humanity can stop this war before it starts. But Valari, you need to understand what this means. I can never go home," she said. And the words hurt more than she expected, even though she had already accepted this truth. "I will be branded a traitor, an enemy of my people. You will be saving your people," Daniel corrected her gently. "Even if they never know it, even if they hate you forever, you will be the one who prevented their extinction." They stood together in the garden, human and Calorian, hands intertwined as the sun set over the death world that had become her home. "There is something else," Valari said quietly. "Something I have not admitted even to myself until now." Daniel waited, patient as always. "When I think about the future, when I imagine the years ahead, I do not see myself in a Calorian palace surrounded by my people," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I see myself here, in this garden, with you. Is that what you want?" Daniel asked, and there was something new in his voice, something vulnerable and hopeful. "I think it might be," Valari admitted. "I never expected this. I came here prepared to endure a loveless political arrangement with a monster from a death world. And instead I found a man who brings me flowers and burns breakfast and cries over old photographs of his grandparents." Daniel laughed, a warm sound that made her heart flutter in a way she had not experienced before. "I am not sure that is a very romantic description," he said with a smile. "It is the truth," Valari replied, "and I have learned that truth is rare enough to be treasured." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a gentle touch that asked nothing and demanded nothing. And Valari realized that she was no longer a princess of the Calorian Empire. She was just Valari, a woman standing in a garden with a man she had unexpectedly come to love, preparing to betray everything she had known in order to save both their peoples from a war that would consume them all. Tomorrow they would contact the authorities and share the intelligence that might prevent an apocalypse. But tonight, for just a few more hours, they stood together in the fading light. Two people who had found something precious in the ruins of conflict. And Valari understood at last why humans fought so hard to protect what they loved. Because love, true love, was worth any sacrifice. The intelligence Valari provided changed everything. Within hours of her confession, She and Daniel were brought before the United Earth Defense Council, a room full of admirals and generals and political leaders, who listened with grave faces as she laid out everything she knew about the impending Calorian invasion. She showed them the fleet positions, the weapon specifications, the planned attack routes, and most importantly, the date. Humanity had 4 months to prepare for an assault designed to annihilate them. "Why should we trust you?" demanded Admiral Catherine Blake, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. "You are a Calorian princess. This could all be a trap to lure our forces out of position. If I wanted to betray you, I would not be sitting here," Valari replied, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. "I would have simply provided the targeting data my handlers requested and watched the missiles fall. I am here because I have seen what humanity truly is, and I believe my people are marching toward their own extinction." "She is telling the truth," Daniel said, standing beside her with unwavering support. "I have lived with Valari for almost a year, and I know when she is being honest. She's betrayed her own empire to save both our peoples." The council debated for hours, while Valari waited in an adjacent room, Daniel's hand holding hers through the entire agonizing process. Finally, they were summoned back, and Admiral Blake delivered the verdict. "We've decided to trust your intelligence," she said, her stern face softening just slightly. "But we will not simply wait for the attack to come. Humanity does not play defense, Princess Valari. We are going to end this threat before it begins." What followed became known throughout the galaxy as the 30-Hour War, though it was less a war and more a demonstration of exactly why no intelligent species should ever threaten Earth. Humanity struck first with surgical precision, using the intelligence Valari had provided to locate and destroy the Calorian invasion fleet while it was still gathering in staging areas far from Earth. The attack was devastating but carefully targeted. Military assets were eliminated while civilian populations were left untouched, a level of restraint that shocked the Calorian High Council almost as much as the speed and accuracy of the assault. Within 18 hours, the Calorian Navy had effectively ceased to exist. 2,000 warships reduced to debris clouds, their weapons never fired, their crews given exactly 90 seconds to reach escape pods before the killing blows landed. And then humanity did something that truly shattered Calorian understanding of war. Instead of pressing the advantage, instead of moving to conquer or destroy, the United Earth Defense Force broadcast a message to every world in the Calorian Empire. "We do not want your territory," the message said, delivered by Admiral Blake herself. "We do not want your resources or your slaves or your submission. We want only peace and a guarantee that you will never again target civilians. Surrender now, and no more blood will be spilled. Your soldiers can return home to their families. Your empire can continue to exist. And we can build something better than endless war." The High Council responded with fury, ordering every remaining military asset to fight to the death, demanding that the people of the Empire rise up and resist the human menace with every weapon available. But something unexpected happened. The Calorian military refused. Generals who had watched their fleets evaporate in hours understood what Valari had tried to tell them. They had seen the surgical precision of human weapons, had observed the careful restraint that preserved civilian lives, had calculated the simple mathematics of what would happen if humanity decided to stop being gentle. One by one, military commanders across the Empire declared their refusal to continue fighting, citing the futility of opposing a species that could destroy them utterly, but chose instead to offer mercy. The High Council found itself giving orders that no one would follow, screaming into communication systems that had gone silent, watching helplessly as their grand dreams of conquest erupted around them. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a quiet surrender, signed by generals who had chosen survival over pride. Humanity asked for no territory, no tribute, no slaves, no reparations. They asked only for peace and a binding agreement that Calorian weapons would never again target civilian installations. The treaty was signed on Earth, in the same city where Valari had first arrived as a reluctant bride. And she stood beside Daniel as representatives from 12 other galactic empires gathered to witness the ceremony. She saw how those representatives looked at the humans, saw the fear and respect and careful calculation in their eyes, saw them all reaching the same conclusion she had reached months ago. Humanity was not to be challenged, not because they were cruel or aggressive or conquest-hungry, but because they were none of those things until provoked. A species that offered mercy to defeated enemies, that fought only to protect what they loved, that measured victory not in territory gained, but in lives saved. Such a species was truly terrifying, because their moral clarity made their violence unstoppable. "You could have destroyed us," the Calorian general who signed the treaty said to Admiral Blake, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Your fleet had complete superiority. You could have bombarded our worlds into ash. Why did you stop?" "Because that is not who we are," Admiral Blake replied simply. "We fight to protect, not to conquer. When you stopped being a threat, there was no reason to keep fighting." Years passed, and Valari watched as the galaxy slowly absorbed the lesson of the 30-hour war. Empire after empire quietly adjusted their policies, removing Earth from their list of potential targets, instructing their military commanders to avoid any action that might be interpreted as a threat to humanity. Trade relationships developed, cultural exchanges began, and slowly the fear transformed into something resembling respect. Valari and Daniel built a life together, a real marriage born not from political necessity, but from genuine love. And they became symbols of what peace could look like between species. She was often asked to speak to delegations from other empires, alien leaders who wanted to understand humanity, who wanted to know the secret to coexisting with the Death World species. Her answer was always the same, the truth she had learned through pain and fear, and ultimately through love. "Do not threaten their families," she would tell them. "Do not harm their children. Do not give them a reason to fight. Because humans do not want war, and they will build beautiful things with you and trade fairly and keep their promises. But if you threaten what they love, if you hurt the innocent ones they have sworn to protect, they will become something else entirely. What will they become?" The visitors would always ask. "The last thing you will ever see," Valari would reply, and she would watch them shiver despite the warmth of Earth's sun. On quiet evenings, when the grandchildren were asleep and the house was still, Valari would sit with Daniel on their porch and look up at the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her once, meaning the betrayal, the exile, the permanent separation from her birth people. "Never," she replied, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I gained more than I lost. I gained you and our children, and the understanding that love is the greatest force in the universe, even greater than humanity's stubbornness." Daniel asked with a teasing smile. "They are the same thing," Valari said, smiling back at the man who had shown her what it meant to be human. "Love is just stubbornness wearing its Sunday clothes." Daniel laughed, and the sound echoed across the garden he had tended for 50 years, and somewhere in the stars above them, empires made careful note to never, ever give humanity a reason to fight, because they had all learned the lesson that Valari once tried to teach her own people. Humans do not fight wars to win. They fight because losing means someone they love does not come home. And there is no force in the universe stronger than a human protecting their family.